Over the last several years, and especially after the adoption of the Patriot Act in 2001, well, many people have come to the conclusion that the current situation right here in America, it resembles that of a police state more and more. Unlike what the founding fathers of this country had imagined, it appears that the federal government has been ballooning and increasing in size and giving itself the ability to both monitor and control the American citizens more and more every single year. And so, whether it's controlling what you and I can and cannot say through their partnerships with social media companies, whether it's things like the NSA spy program, which allows for the actual warrantless surveillance of Americans, or the corollary abuse of the FISA spy warrant system, which allows for government officials to effectively spy on American citizens, whether it's the FBI allocating their precious resources to track down parents who happen to speak up at school board meetings, whether it's these domestic terrorist plots which get foiled only to later be revealed that they were actually just cases of government entrapment, or whether it's these federal bureaucrats within the intelligence agencies going ahead and influencing American elections, well, all these seemingly disparate examples, they reinforce the idea that if we're not already living in a police state, we are perhaps well on our way. And so, with that as the general background, a new film has just been released exposing exactly this problem. It's called Police State, and essentially, it serves as a wake-up call exposing the threat to the American way of life. And I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to sit down and speak with Mr. Dinesh D'Souza. He is the director of the film, and we had a phenomenal and far-reaching discussion about not only what he was able to uncover throughout the course of his investigation, which ultimately culminated in the film, but also what the truth is like behind the scenes at these agencies, and also what can actually be done to turn back the tide. It was a phenomenal discussion that I hope you'll enjoy. Dinesh, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe to start with, for the audience members who haven't seen the film yet, can you please define what a police state is and tell us whether, in your opinion, we're already living in one?
A good way to define a police state is simply to look at police states around the world. I think obviously of North Korea, China, Iran, the old Soviet Union, and ask what are the characteristics or traits that these countries, these states have in common. Well, they have mass surveillance of the citizens. They have systematic censorship. They have political indoctrination in the schools and in the media, a lot of propaganda. They are one-party states. They sometimes allow elections, but they never allow effective opposition. If an effective opposition leader comes up, they try to block him, to arrest him, in some cases to exile him. Police states also tend to undermine religious liberty, to go after the church, and they also have political prisoners. So that's a pretty good working definition. Now, apply those characteristics to America, and you will see that to one degree or another, all those traits are now present in the United States. So I'm not saying that we are a full-fledged police state, but we certainly are on our way to becoming a police state.
Dinesh, let me ask you this. You know, when myself and a lot of other people think about the federal bureaucracy, we oftentimes think that, well, the federal bureaucrats are overwhelmingly left-wing. I mean, you can see from the, the political donations that something like 95% of political donations from the federal employees typically go to left-wing or progressive candidates, right? But then on the flip side, when we think of law enforcement, whether it's at the local level or even at the federal level, we oftentimes think of those individuals as more conservative-leaning. And so is that something that you uncovered throughout the course of your investigation for making the film? Are they more conservative-leaning? Like, is that correct? And if so, is there any pushback against what's happening from the rank and file?
Well, the typical law enforcement guy is not a leftist, is certainly not the same type of guy as, say, a staffer on a Democratic committee on Capitol Hill, or even somebody working in the Biden administration as a political appointee. By and large, people in law enforcement are very similar to people in the military. They tend to be people who go by the book. They've been trained all their life to sort of be company men, organization men, to follow instructions, to do what they're told, to sort of rise within the system and within the hierarchy. So their conservatism is not so much ideological, it's operational. And I think the police state, the problem with this is that if you are able to corrupt the system, corrupt the leadership, have strategic people who are giving you bad instructions, saying, for example, to an FBI agent, hey, look, our focus now is not, for example, on MS-13 and its child trafficking operation. We're now focusing on the subversives, the sort of domestic extremists who are the kind of people who went to the Capitol on January 6th. So here's a grandmother, she's 70 years old, but don't really worry about what she did. Your job is to bust into her apartment, grab her, twist her arms behind her back, arrest her. If she resists, pull her down the stairs, pull her into the street if necessary, let her neighbors gawk at her, and we'll let the courts figure out her real level of guilt or innocence. So you see how, by and large, a good guy who's an FBI guy, he has a family, he has a normal house, can somehow be recruited to do something that is so barbaric. But it's because the police state has ways of making good people do very bad things.
That story you just told, was that a real story that you came across in your investigation?
It mirrors many. So we have, for example, 2 or 3 very emotionally powerful profiles of political prisoners from January 6th. But we also show a lot of other ordinary people who are just going about their lives, and they're involved in some civic matter or the other. They might be involved, for example, as parents concerned about what their kids are being taught, or maybe they're pro-life activists, or maybe in some cases it's just some guy who went down to Washington, D.C. around January 6th, but wasn't even involved in the events of January 6th, and is still nevertheless on a kind of suspected terrorism watch list. So the problem with police states is they become very bureaucratic, very stupid. They don't try ultimately to distinguish between even the guilty and the innocent. They become ultimately a machine for subjugating people and reducing them to a certain kind of servitude.
Dinesh, in your film, you discussed how one of the largest pushes of this country towards a police state was the implementation of the Patriot Act, which of course came on the heels of 9/11, right? And now we're in a situation in 2023, starting just a few weeks ago, with the war between Israel and Hamas. The director of the FBI recently came out and said that all police chiefs around the country should be on high alert for increased activity, potential terrorist warnings. And of course, the open southern border sort of adds to that. I'll ask you 2 questions. The first is, do you think that resources have been shifted away from terrorism towards more like domestic threats, like parents, political enemies, such that it might actually weaken the response towards a terrorism attack by the FBI? Do you believe that's the case?
Without a doubt, and it's not so much that I am conjecturing that is the case. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, has gone before Congress and said our top priority is domestic terrorism and domestic extremism. We think that, for example, white supremacy poses a greater threat than any other threat to the country today. So there is a open profession on the part of police agencies of government that they are moving toward a domestic focus, and toward a focus really on the political opponents of the Biden regime. So it's not too surprising to me that they completely missed this Hamas attack. I mean, just think about the magnitude of 1,000 people being able to get past it's an Israel intelligence failure to be sure, but it's also a U.S. intelligence failure. And I think that the latter is due to radically misplaced priorities.
And if that premise is true and these misplaced priorities potentially leave a gap for something, I would hate to say it, but something similar that happened in Israel to happen in the States, where there's a surprise terrorist attack, could just be a lone actor, could be a small group. Would that justify Patriot Act 2.0? I can imagine a scenario where there's a terrorist attack, all the media would overwhelmingly begin to question why, how do we miss this? How did the intelligence services miss this? There would be a large hoopla about it. And the end result, I can easily imagine, being to give more money and more power to these agencies, not to investigate them for their failure, but to instead just give them more authority. Do you envision that being the case? And if so, is there any way to avoid it?
Well, I mean, I think that there is a danger of what you say. But on the other hand, if there was a terrorist attack, let's just say by Hamas in America, this would cause a problem for the left. The reason it causes a problem is that the immediate target would be, of course, American Muslims. In other words, how did Hamas establish these cells? Who are these people and where do they live and so on? So for the left, remember, the left was actually very aggressive in defending the civil liberties of Muslims in the aftermath of 9/11, and to some degree they were correct. But those same organizations that funded lawyers and erected a massive apparatus to defend Muslims in the aftermath of 9/11 have gone totally silent when the target is conservatives and patriots and, of course, the defendants of January 6th. So I foresee the left trying much more to fan the flames of fear in other ways. So, for example, climate change is very good for them. So, because it is events of fear that cause people to want to say, all right, I'm willing to give up this liberty. If we think about the events that have caused the greatest subtraction of liberties in this country, 9/11 was one of them. Fast forward to COVID, that was another. January 6th was a third. So the left has opportunistically realized that fear is a great weapon to get people to say, all right, I'm willing to exchange a good part of my freedom in exchange for the security and safety that you're promising me.
Let me ask you this. In the film, you were, during the one part, you were discussing the Hunter Biden laptop story and how it was suppressed by the intelligence services. And this is something you said in the film. This is a quote. The police agencies of the government, acting on behalf of the Bidens, moved to suppress public discourse of the contents of the Hunter Biden laptop. So here you said acting on behalf of the Bidens. In your investigation, how do you figure that? Is it the case that you believe that they're acting on behalf, as in like Joe Biden or Obama or someone else tells, this is the objective, this is what I want you to do? Or is it just kind of a coalescing sort of ideology that drives everyone in the same direction, and looking outside, it sort of seems like it's being directed, but it could not be. It could just be a bunch of different people who are driven by the same ideology moving towards a common goal. Which are the two? No,
I actually am referring to things in a very specific way. The police agencies of the U.S. government are part of the executive branch. They are, it is true, funded by Congress, but they answer to Biden. I mean, who does Merrick Garland work for? He works for Biden. He is Biden's, in a sense, chief lawyer. I remember in the Obama years, he referred to Eric Holder, who was Merrick Garland's equivalent, as his wingman. This is his wingman, like a, kind of an analogy from being a pilot. And so I think that these police agencies recognize that they are answerable to Biden, so they are working on behalf of him in that sense. But they're also working on behalf of him in a different sense. And that is that the police state, any tyrannical regime is always going to say, who are my friends who are helping to build the police state? And then who are my enemies who are threatening the police state? So I think from the point of view of these police agencies of government, not just the FBI, but the Department of Homeland Security and also the CIA, they basically say the Democrats and the left are helping us construct a police state. They are our friends. They are in fact protecting our crimes, so we need to protect their crimes. And by contrast, Trump, the conservatives, this is a problem. If Trump comes back in, who knows what he's going to do? Who knows who he's going to fire, how he's going to dismantle and reorganize the FBI, for example. So he poses a mortal danger, if you will, to the police state. And so the police state relentlessly goes after him. Sometimes when we say, oh, there's a double standard, the police state is treating Trump differently than Biden. Well, that's only if you assume that the police state is somehow impartial and aspires to hold itself to a single standard of law abidingness. But if the police state is looking at it differently, who are my friends, who are my enemies, then the police state's actions are completely consistent. And so when you say the police state's actions are completely consistent, I guess I imagine talking about sort of the upper echelon of the decision makers, not necessarily the rank and file, but the people like Merrick Garland, right, who are at the top making the decisions. So let me ask you, along that line, are you familiar with Project 2025? I've heard of it. It's a project such that if a conservative president were to take power in 2025, he would have a database to pull from to replace some of the people in government to be more conservatively ideologically aligned. Do you think that's an actual solution to replace the people at the top, or would that just be a Band-Aid, because then when the administrations change towards the left, it would still be the same problem? What would be the actual solution? Would it be stripping power from these agencies? You need this is a battle on many fronts. So for example, when you take censorship, this is something for the Supreme Court to handle. And happily, the case of Missouri versus Biden is making its way to the court. The court has already granted cert. They'll be hearing the case. They'll be issuing a ruling in the spring. these things move more slowly than I would like, because I know millions of people have been censored over the past few years. Millions of people are being censored now. The court is allowing millions of people to continue to be censored until they make their decision in the spring. But nevertheless, they have a chance, the Supreme Court does, to administer a massive drop kick to the police state. Now, there are other things that you can do if you win the presidency. You can revamp agencies of government. You can do, if you have the House and the Senate, there are things you can do legislatively. Even if you don't have those things, but you have Republican governors and secretaries of state and attorneys general, there are things that can be done at the state level. There are things that we as individuals can do. So this is a case where there's not a single solution, but the police state needs to be resisted on all fronts, and that's the way to roll it back.
About a month ago, my team and I were doing a special segment on what took place over in Michigan with the entrapment. Of course, you're aware of it with Gresham Whitmer and that case. And we reached out to an individual. He's a reporter named Trevor Aronson. He wrote a book called The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. Now, we thought that we would reach out to him and get his expert opinion on what happened in Michigan, but he sent us back an email, and it really surprised my team and I. I want to read this email to you and get your take, because it sort of fits into the motif of the film. He wrote this to us, quote, "Conservative media have done a very good job of amplifying the Michigan case to make it appear as if the FBI is disproportionately targeting conservatives, when in fact, stings like the one in Michigan are exceedingly rare compared to the hundreds of stings that have targeted people of color and left-wing activists over the past 2 decades. He says, I can count on one hand the number of terrorism stings that target the right-wing white men in America. By contrast, more than 350 defendants, mostly people of color, have been caught up in international terrorism stings." What would your response be to criticism like that?
Well, look, Trevor Aronson has done some really good work in showing real abuses of power by the police agencies of government after 9/11 vis-a-vis Muslims. And I think what happened is that the FBI and all these agencies got a big trove of cash from the government to go after terrorism. And then after 9/11, they might have expected there to be a lot of other incidents, but there weren't. And it may be because US bombings abroad and so on had immobilized those groups, and they weren't able to carry out that kind of attack. But the bureaucratic agencies of government were like, okay, well, our funding is going to dry up, so we need to manufacture some terrorism. And so that now they started their entrapment campaign, and they've become really good at it. And Trevor Aronson has actually documented it pretty well. So I agree with him. Going all the way in the years after 9/11, the FBI and these other agencies became really sneaky about going to, I'm just talking generally here, but they'd find some students who are radical and denounce America. And then the FBI informant goes, well, hey, have you guys thought about joining ISIS? No, not really, man. Well, you're saying all these things. You want to be a soldier for Islam and so on. Why don't you join ISIS? Well, I don't know how I would join ISIS. Well, guess what? There's a training camp that's going on in Pakistan. Have you ever thought of going? Would you like to go? Well, I don't have any money. Well, how about if we give you some money? Well, I don't have a passport. Well, how about if we get you a passport? So you see what's going on here? The FBI is luring someone who might be radical, but into doing something that they would not otherwise do. And then right before they're set to do it, bust them. Oh, we are amazing. We just busted a dangerous terrorist. So Trevor Aronson has done a good job exposing this. Now, interestingly, when the target becomes conservatives, patriots, Christians, Republicans, Trevor Aronson has kind of gone silent. And so this guy is not, as it turns out, a consistent defender of civil liberties. If he were, he'd be defending them across the board. But he is ultimately concerned about the civil liberties of the left. Let's remember the left was a big defender of free speech in the 60s. Why? Because they were the ones who were being targeted. But the moment that they got power in the universities, they were happy to turn around and suppress the free speech of conservatives. So it turns out that these leftists are not committed to civil liberties per se. They only mean civil liberties for them. Notice that when Elon Musk banned a couple of leftists on X, then called Twitter, for one day, they were screaming, what about our free speech, quoting John Stuart Mill. So they value free speech, but they value free speech for themselves, and yet they're happy to trample on the free speech of other people.
So you mentioned the January 6th cases. We ran a story recently, just earlier this week, about Jake Lang. He's been in semi-solitary confinement, but jailed for the last 1,000 days, basically since 2020. 2021, so shortly after January 6th, he was jailed in upstate New York. They took him over to Virginia. He's been there ever since. In your investigation, did you uncover how or why this is happening? Because the more I look into it, the more it just seems like these judges are putting these individuals into indefinite confinement pending trial. But there's no real reason other than, hey, they're a flight risk or they're a danger to the community, even though that does not, on the surface at least, seem to be the case. Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, it all comes down to the validity of the original narrative. If January 6th was truly a kind of insurrection to overthrow the government, then these are dangerous insurrectionists, including, by the way, someone who strolled in the Capitol for 5 minutes, didn't harm anything, didn't do even a graffiti, was there while officers were present and left without harming anyone. Even that guy is part of this insurrection. So then judges look at that and go, well, I'm looking at an insurrectionist. Well, how can I let that guy go home to his family? Who knows what he's going to be plotting? He might be concocting the next insurrection right now, for all I know. Now, to you and me, and in a normal frame of mind, this is like a form of lunacy. That is actually not a correct judgment. That is not who that guy is. That is not why he went to Washington, D.C. That's not even why he found himself in the Capitol. So there's a driving falsehood that has to be attacked. And that's really what the movie does, is it doesn't try to parse. If you accept the assumption, then the individual cases all fall into line. You have to attack the root assumption. And that's what the movie does. It really asks, what is the true meaning of January 6th? And it explores the police state in many dimensions that go way beyond the current debate.
Dinesh, can you leave the audience with a bit of hope? Leave them with a bit of hope for the future. What are some positives on the horizon? What can be done?
Well, the hope is that the awareness of an emerging police state will bring out a certain aspect in the American character that has long been in the American character, and that is that we will not put up with tyranny. We are not those kinds of people. We want to be left alone. We want to live our own lives. You know, I remember watching many years ago on the Nature Channel the idea that although the predator is fast, the antelope is actually faster. But the antelope needs to know that there's a predator in the trees. And if the antelope knows that, the antelope is going to take off and the antelope is going to be able to save itself. It's only when the antelope is lulled into a false sense of security. Oh, I hear a movement in the trees, but you know, Dinesh, it's the wind. Or, yeah, there may be a predator, but it's going to land on somebody else's back, not mine. This is the mentality that the police state loves. They love to get you because you're gullible. And so my movie is sort of an antidote to this kind of gullibility.
Well, Dinesh, thank you so much. For anyone watching, we'll throw a link to the movie. It'll be down there in the description box below. Otherwise, Dinesh, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.